Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset. And today we get to talk with someone from Toronto, Canada. I'm going to do my best to pronounce her name. First name is Chenai, and her last name is Kadungure, or something close to that. There's a D in it, but people, if you're speaking appropriately, you don't pronounce the D. But some people do, and my screen reader does. It actually makes her last name Kadungure. So there you go. Figure that out, Chenai. It's technology. But we really are glad to have you here on Unstoppable Mindset. Chenai is a very passionate individual. She helps to build dynamic and valuable relationships, and she's been voted one of the top 100 Black women to watch in Canada, and that's worth doing. So, Chenai, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Yes, I'm so glad. I'm so glad and excited to be here. Thanks, Michael.
Well, thank you for being here. We're really grateful that you are taking the time to do it. And we're doing something a little bit different today, everyone. We're doing this on a Saturday. We normally do things during the week. And it is 6:30 in the afternoon in Toronto, so we don't want Chenai to starve. So we'll move right along, but we'll have a lot of fun doing this, I'm sure. And we'll go from there. So why don't we start? I love to start this way. Tell me a little bit about kind of the early Chenai growing up and so on.
The early Chenai was a bit of a troublemaker. I went to a Dominican convent high school in Harare, Zimbabwe. And I think I've always been someone who just goes their own lane. So I'll say that the early Chenai is not too different from the current Chenai, just a little bit less responsible, maybe.
So how long were you in Zimbabwe?
All the way till I was 18. Our economy then crashed. We basically had to do what, I guess people call it like economic migrants. We all had to sort of study in South Africa and overseas. So I went to South Africa for my undergrad and my first master's. And then after about 5 years of working, I went to North Carolina for a second master's and ended up in Toronto. So I've traveled around.
So when you were in North Carolina, did you drink sweet tea?
Oh, yes. That is
Did you?
glorious diabetes in a cup. But I did enjoy it. I mean, we were colonized by the British, so tea is very common for us back home, too.
Well, I like tea. I like hot tea. And as people who listen to this regularly or who have read my book, Thunderdog, know I love PG Tips tea. And it's a hot, vibrant British tea. I've never been a great fan of sweet tea just because it is too sweet for me. But I appreciate it, and I'm glad people like it. I was actually talking with someone from North Carolina yesterday, and they were asking me if I liked sweet tea, and I said the same thing, that I'm not a great sweet tea fan. But on the other hand, I love sausage biscuits. So that's another one from North Carolina. But we do what we can.
Yeah, I still miss the Bojangles, though. I think that is my favorite Carolinian product, Bojangles.
Well, there you go. Well, it's a fun area. And so what took you, well, let me start this way. When you went and got your bachelor's and your first master's, what were they in?
Okay, my undergrad was media sociology and gender studies. And then I got more and more into the sociology side of things, wanting to understand how society works, why society looks the way it is. So my first master's was a master of philosophy in diversity studies. So before diversity studies was hip, I always tell people I cared about diversity back then.
There you go. So that was your first master's. And what was your second one when you went to North Carolina?
I went to North Carolina on a Rotary Peace Fellowship. It was one of those Rotary World Peace Fellowships. I'm a Rotarian. Well, now I'm a Rotarian, but back then you can't do the fellowship if you're a Rotarian. So I went to the Duke UNC Peace Center. And we always say peace is possible if a Tar Heel and a Dookie can get along.
Oh, yeah.
Together.
Well, and Well, so there are three, of course. There's NC, UNC, and Duke, and that's a combination to try to make peace between.
Yes. I think it's like the basketball is usually where it all comes to a head.
Yeah.
But yes, there are days where it's not safe to wear a certain type of blue.
Yeah, well, I understand, and basketball is the thing. I was there once, just when I think it was UNC and NC State were playing to see who was going to, I think, have top bragging rights in the conference. Or maybe, well, no, it wasn't Duke. It was UNC and NC State. And all TV was preempted by the game, needless to say. No surprise.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. People live, eat, and breathe that. I'd say that's the equivalent of, I guess, hockey here.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got hockey up there. You've got the Maple Leafs and all of that. Well, so what took you from North Carolina then to Toronto?
So I've always had a cousin who's here, and she always used to say, come to Canada. And I always used to tell her, sorry, it's too cold. And then as the years went by, I started hearing some good things about Canada. And I thought, it's worth a shot. Since I was already in North America, I figured this is the next step. So I came here, and I really love being here. I enjoy being here.
How long have you been there?
So since 2018, okay. I did a 1-year stint in Malawi with Care Canada and then came back. So give or take, I guess it's on 5 going on 6 years.
Wow. Well, you moved around some, needless to say.
I am a traveler. I think that's my if people have a rest language, mine is travel. There's something about being somewhere else that just it helps me.
Do you get bored being in one place too long, or you just love to travel and experience new things and still like to have a home base?
I think it's both, and I love encountering a new culture and, trying new foods and, being able to experience a place for myself. Because I think we all have a stereotypical idea of what parts of the world look and feel like. But I think when you're there, something about it helps you appreciate the otherness, but also appreciate where you're from or where you live. And so I feel like, there's something that always brings me back to myself when I do that. But also I think it's the cultures, right? The work-life balance culture around the world is something I enjoy. I feel like we are high on urgency culture here. So sometimes I need to physically be in a different place to get myself to rest.
Do you think it's different up there than it is here in the US?
I feel like I think we might be balanced. I hear people say some things that are similar. Like I feel like people kind of brag on how productive and how busy they are in North America. Whereas, I'm originally Zimbabwean. I think the work-life balance is a little bit different. And even when I spend some time in the Caribbean, same kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and you said the urgency culture, and that it just makes sense. I think that we are so locked into having everything instant, urgency, and so on, and we've got to do it now. It is unfortunate because it doesn't necessarily go that way. We haven't really learned to pace, and we want a lot of things now that we don't have any control over, and then we get mad when we don't get them.
This is true. But I guess it's also about the external expectation of us, right? That I think if the most productive thing we could do in a day was to rest or to, lose the desire for control or things like that, I think if we had a different metric, we might do things differently. But I think the dominant culture is you need to be as busy as everyone else.
Yeah, that seems to be the way it goes and the flow of activity these days. And the problem is we lose some perspectives about that, which is a little unfortunate. But what do you do? So what have you been doing since you got your master's degrees? I'm assuming that while you were doing that, you were pretty much busy full-time with being a student.
Absolutely. I think I'm working on trying to be the less busy person. I always have so many things going on, volunteering here, boards here, full-time job here, like just carrying too many things. But I would say there's always been a sort of like nonprofit and social and community service side to everything I've ended up doing. I think it's just by design. I was an interactor in high school, so they, in Interact they talk about service above self, and I just stuck. And I think that's what it's always been for me.
So, what do you do now that you're out of school? What's your job and all that sort of stuff?
Oh, yes. So I am the executive director of the Black Physicians Association of Ontario. So we have, I would say we are both in the supporting medical education for Black medical learners and the our members, which are existing physicians, residents and existing physicians. But also a large part of that is trying to improve health outcomes for Black community in Ontario. So we have our work cut out there, but I think so many of our members are instrumental to things that are happening now. So as an example, they just announced that breast cancer screening can start as early as 40 in Canada. It used to only be from about 50 onwards, but we started seeing that, okay, there's a lot of like younger people who are getting it. And so that kind of advocacy comes from work, like from groups like ours. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Now you're not an MD at all, and you're not in that career path, I gather.
Yes, no. But I've always felt like I was a healer. I'm just too squirmish to have ever gone the medical route. My mother was a nurse, so I've always been closely connected to medicine in some ways, I'd say.
So what do you do as a CEO of the association?
Oh, what do I not do is the question. I think when nonprofits are smaller, you end up being an everything person. So it's like, you're doing business development, you're doing operations, you are talking to accountants, you're on the recruiting side, you're working with volunteers, you're in the meetings with the universities about different things. So yeah, we're all over. I think when we think of public health in Canada, especially for Black community, I'm in most of those spaces.
Mm-hmm. Why is there a need for a Black Physicians Association as opposed to just a physicians association? And I'm not saying there isn't. I'm just curious to hear your answer.
Yes. I mean, I think there is, when we're looking at equity, there is always I think the default for most people in most places is to be mainstream, i.e., one stroke for everyone. But I think there's something about listening to specific needs of different communities and making sure they get the support they need in that different way, right? I think it's sometimes very hard to be able to be all things to all people. And so I feel like sometimes when you have these like more identity-related group or like, oppression-related groups and things like that, I think there's a bit more weight to the voice, right? And people will always be able to coalesce and meet in the general association. So here we have Canadian Medical Association and Ontario Medical Association, and everyone's in those. And then you have more sort of like niche ones for specific groups. And also for us in Canada, Black physicians only make up 2.7% of the physician population. So I want you to imagine that in a room, right? It's just people who feel very lonely in their craft and sometimes just need to get together and know that there's someone who understands their challenges. Yeah.
Do you think the association can improve those numbers and get more Black physicians into the workforce?
Oh, we are trying. I won't lie. Right now, we have things like we're doing studies on like the physician suicides and things like that, because there's a lot of physician burnout, I would say, since around the pandemic and onwards. So we are trying to solve a lot of problems in one go, but I think the mental health and support that comes from networks like ours has been proven to increase the number of Black medical learners. To give you an example, Temerity School of Medicine, which is, I'd say, one of the most popular Ontario med schools, has, some of the people, they reported a 10-fold increase in Black sort of like medical learner signups because of different support programs we put into place there. So I think it's not an overnight process, but just being able to say, have we thought about, maybe we need to do this. This is how we can include more people. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done for most racialized physicians, I'd say. Yeah.
Do you find that there is a difference in percentage of, say, Black physician suicides as opposed to physician suicides overall? Is there that kind of a disparity in the numbers, do you think?
I think Canada has the problem that we don't collect a lot of data on these things. So community ends up having to be the ones collecting the data. We're going a lot on US data for a lot of these things for now. But we do hear similar kind of themes around the challenges people face. But I know that since there's still a lot of stigma around mental health in Black community, that in itself, I think, would make a difference, right, to the level of access we'll see of people actually taking those supports. So I think that's a big thing. The other thing is people being able to actually see that there's a problem. I think, compassion fatigue, right, in the healthcare sector in general, there's sometimes a challenge with boundaries. Like, how do you know if you've reached your limit? How do you know that you now need to be a patient and not a doctor, right? And we know that that's a challenge. So I think we'll have to loop back and have this conversation 5 years from now, and I'll have the stats.
It will be interesting to discover and hear what you discover, but it will be interesting to see. And my immediate thought is that any group that feels marginalized definitely has challenges over other groups. I mean, we find it in I don't know about suicides and so on, but we do find marginalization with disabilities, and there are a lot of things that come up. And even diversity doesn't include disabilities, typically speaking. They talk about race and gender and sexual orientation and other things, and don't include disabilities.
Don't get me started on that, honestly, because I think it ends up being, and I don't know what it is, because every time I have an invisible disability, but I always feel like for people with visible disabilities, it's like, I feel like it's 10 times harder just to get that, like the foot in the door or whatever, because people are trying to spend as little as possible. I'm speaking broadly in general. Right? People are trying to spend as little as possible to support staff in general, right? So if you're trying to work and you need accommodations, I just don't see that kind of willingness, across the board, even in sectors like ours that are supposed to be more compassionate. I see a lot of the same problems, because I also serve on the Meta Center board. So we hear a lot about, like, okay, these are some of the challenges the residents are facing. And I'm telling you, it's unreal. We haven't even scratched the surface of the lack of support that's still required in disability, honestly. Yeah.
Well, and why do you think that is?
I think it's because it's a mixture. Part of it is there's always the excuse of, it's a minority. It's a small group of people. So, as far as the overall impact, it won't be that huge, right? Number one. Number two is I think we just have an empathy problem in general in the world. If it's not something happening in my house or in my body, it doesn't matter. And I think that's huge, right? For a lot of the people I work with, even when we're doing things at Meta Center, a lot of it is always, I have a relative, there's a connection point. And yet it's like, I'm like, empathy in general just doesn't really seem to be there. I think with me, it's a mixture of faith and culture, right? Africans are communitarians. We even have the idea of Ubuntu. I'm not well unless you're well. And so part of that is like, trying to be a bit more equitable in our approaches, right?
Well, the other thing I would say is that when people talk about it being a small minority, the statistics show that in general, roughly about 25% of people have some sort of disability. So it's not really that small of a minority. Where it does get to be a problem is that the minority is made up of a number of different kinds of ways that the so-called disability manifests. Of course, what I try to do is to level the playing field. And what I tell people is the reality is everyone in the world has a disability. And for most of you, it's light dependency. You don't do well if the lights suddenly go out. You have to find a way to get new light in order to be able to function. But the light bulb was invented to give you light on demand. And so mostly your disability is covered up, but it doesn't change the fact that it still exists because it does exist. And I've seen it happen all too many times. But I think also we have such a fear. Oh, I could end up tomorrow in a wheelchair, or I could end up being blind, or whatever. And so fear and the fact that we don't include disabilities in the conversation just doesn't seem to help a lot.
I completely agree. And also, one that's a little bit more insidious is if the community doesn't have money. I feel like there's a way of putting pressure on certain topics, and you kind of say, okay, we're not going to be able to put our dollars into X organization unless they are seen to care about this issue. And I think there's some of that, like, what's in it for me money wise. People won't really understand that, because I do feel now that, there's been performative inclusion, and it's about being able to get money, or being able to receive the kind of, call it perception capital or something, right? For the larger organizations when they're funding issues. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of different factors that go into it. You said you have an invisible disability, and what is that?
I just have ADHD.
Uh-huh. How has that affected you in terms of going through and getting an education and what you do now on the job and so on?
Well, I think I came from a time and a culture where we don't really test for these things, and the stigma is still really strong. I think people don't want to think that there are any challenges in having any kind of, what do I say? Like, if it's dyslexia, ADHD, all these things, I don't think we even really get the assessments. If I remember us, for us growing up, things may have changed in that realm now, but I think you just kind of get labeled as, oh, you're dumb, or you're not great in school, or, you just kind of get put in a corner. And when I remember my earliest experiences of teachers just kind of acting like I said, like I'm a black sheep or something. So I recall several, almost years in my primary schooling of just kind of sitting outside of the classroom for days on end, because you get kicked out for anything. Oh, your book looks messy, get out. Oh, you're being disruptive, get out. And then you spend most of the afternoon outside. So yeah, I didn't really think that would be so much of there's a barrier outside of me just being dumb or something like that, right? Because we didn't have the nuance or the language for it. So I only more recently found out that's what it was, but I always knew there was something there. I was like, there are things that look a little bit easier for people. I don't know why I struggle with this. Yeah.
I'm amazed at the number of people I've talked with on this podcast, Unstoppable Mindset, who talk about the fact that they have some level of autism, but they didn't even know it and didn't get it diagnosed until they were in their 30s.
Yeah, pretty much. You get to a point where you're just like, I want to figure out what it is. Because for me, I think when I'm my most burnt out, that's when, it's just even more apparent. So when the coping mechanisms stop working, you're like, I need, something else is going on here.
Yeah. I think we're learning. I think that there's growth, but it certainly isn't at the level and to the level that it really needs to be. And disabilities are still the minority that are least talked about, or least involved and least included. And it shouldn't be that way, but it is.
I absolutely agree. I mean, even when we're doing research, right, and we're looking at just even focus groups and we're breaking down categories, the number of times I've sent documents back and I've been like, you've left out disability. So many times I send something back and you've left out that, and it's unreal. And so I think there's a level of resilience that is in the disability community that I can't even begin to imagine, because it's like being invisible, literally.
It is. And being ignored is what it's about to a large degree. Well, one thing I know that you talk about from time to time is the whole concept of authenticity. Why does that matter to you?
I feel like it's a trait of, I think it's about integrity, but I also think personal integrity is so much harder. Like I think there's a general sort of understood idea of like, oh, I did what I said I'm going to do. But the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that so few people get to just fully be themselves, whether it's in their jobs, in their marriages, in their faith, it's just such a huge thing to be yourself and 100% yourself. And so for me, I think that's something like I gave it a word and I decided to call it authenticity. And honestly, I think if I look at all the leaders I've respected and liked the most, that's what it is. And I think it's rare. I think that as a trait is rare.
Why is that?
Well, some of it is what we discussed before, right? I think there is from when you're born, you have people telling you have to be a certain way, you have to think a certain way, you have to study certain things, you have to do certain jobs. There's always something, whether it's society, culture, weighing in on how you need to show up in the world. And I think more often than not, we want, as much as we care about personal control, we really are about controlling other people too. That's what I can really put it to, because there's a lot of performance that happens. And it's like, sometimes it's performance for survival, but a lot of times I think it's also just performance for approval. Like if I show up in this way, then I'll be accepted. Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter what you may truly feel. It's that people want you to be a certain way. So you become inauthentic, if you will.
Pretty much. You're like, oh, it just becomes your life. The things you do ended up becoming like your habits, or, that's what you've invested in. And so that's where you are. And I think there are a lot of people who get, 30, 40 years down the line, they realize they lived other people's lives. And I that's the thing I wouldn't want. I don't want to look back at my life 30 years from now and feel like I lived someone else's life.
Do you think there's any kind of a trend on the part of people to want to be more authentic and to buck that concept?
Definitely. I think when we talk about leaders who do things differently, or even what I see with, I guess, Gen Z and sort of like the generations coming over, I feel like their BS radar is a lot stronger. Or maybe it's because I feel like they're a lot more judgmental, because they kind of expect you to understand that they're human. Whereas I think some of the generations before were like, you need to be a productive person. You need to, show up in this way. And, whether it's your church or, there were a lot of different places that had expectations of you. I think a lot of the younger people now are just very, they're not ashamed of showing up as they are, of saying, today I'm in my sweats because that's what I feel like. And, I should show up that way, So I feel like with time, we've opened up a bit. A simple example I could think of is, I know in the tech sector, there isn't an expectation that people come buttoned up in suits and things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's a time where I think that might have been the most offensive thing a person did when they walked into a meeting. He wore sneakers to an interview, So I feel like those are some of the ways we are slowly now becoming less, I guess, judgy about how other people should behave.
An interesting paradox. I know that when I started selling, and I took sales courses and I met with any number of people, they would give examples like, so in the East Coast or in a number of places in important meetings, you show up if you're a man in a suit and tie, or women wear dresses and skirts and all that. But I'm going to use men just for a moment, a suit and tie and so on. But you don't do that if you go to Texas. You can wear jeans and cowboy boots and it's totally acceptable. And that was something I heard 30 years ago and 40 years ago. Yet we still mostly really do have that trend. Oh, you have to look or do things in a particular way. And I think that also contributes to the whole disability discussion a little bit, because the bottom line is, although I want to do and have the right to have equal access to doing the things that you do and having that opportunity, I won't use the same tools or do them in exactly the same way. And we get too locked in again to one certain way of doing things. And it hasn't totally changed at all.
That's actually very true. I think, even when we think of like some of the ideas in business, right? We have about this is how you scale, and all of that has its own culture. And it's like, it's either you do this or you fail. So I think, there is always still a bit more bravery required to fully show up as yourself in some of those
yourself. Yeah. So what do doctors do in Canada? Do they all feel they have to be dressed up and all that, or can they just hide under scrubs and a long white coat?
Well, interestingly enough, I think our membership is 80% family physicians. And so I feel like that's one sort of track where people can still sort of like, have the beat of their own drum. So you'll have people where, to give you an example, like we've got this one pediatrics doctor. I really enjoy her content, and she had pink hair the other day, and I think it's because she's working in peds. Maybe maybe she went with her pink hair somewhere else. There might not be as much of an openness, but I do find that's where there's a little bit more flexibility. I think in general, there are some professions that stick more to what I call the monochrome, the monochrome or the gray, or, they're not really about being colorful, whether it's actually wearing color or being open to too much difference. So I must say, I think because our doctors have had to sort of like be in settings where they can't be themselves, I think when they come to our events and things like that, they embrace being fully themselves. So I probably haven't seen them in their buttoned upness as much. And you'll get certain specialties where I think the buttoned upness is just the way they are. But the minute they're off duty, they're someone else. So there are people living like double lives, I feel, as well, right, in certain professions. So for me, those are the things that are interesting that I think 10, 15 years down the line, it's going to look different. I think we're going to have people be more authentic most of the time. Oh, you're in
pink hair. She must be a fan of Harry Potter and Tonks or something like that, huh?
Probably. I mean, working with children, I'm sure, there's a lot of Harry Potter in our line of work. Yeah.
So how does authenticity change the world or create hope, do you think?
I honestly think that there is so much labor in performance. So if I think of the way I get to show up as a Black woman in so many spaces because I am working in my community and things like that, there's a little bit less translation. So, people talk about code switching and having to be someone else at work and someone else with their friends. I feel I'm really lucky in the way I get to show up as myself. I often joke that I am informal, that when we think of how formalized workplaces are, and yet so many people are performing, right? The minute they leave the office, they feel they can literally let their hair down and be themselves. My hope is that we can get to a point where when we are at work, we can be ourselves in that same way. And I think we saw it even during the pandemic, right? A lot of people got to wear their track pants while on calls, and they were so relieved that they could now be comfortable in the workplace. And that's how I see it. If you have to be uncomfortable to do something, that I think is a challenge. I think we've always put it as, propriety. And I feel like the idea of propriety has always meant that there's a lot of discomfort that you have to just accept. And knowing that doesn't have to be, I think, makes us a little bit more open-minded. And the more open-minded we are, the more empathetic we can be. I do think we should evolve past thinking that if I haven't experienced it, I can't relate to it. Like, I don't need to go hungry for a night to understand that hunger is not great. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I don't need to be homeless to know that stressing about where to sleep is a problem. And so by the same token, for me, exactly like what we're talking about, like I shouldn't be surprised when I get into an elevator and there's actually like sounds. I'm like, I should expect every elevator to have those sounds, because it means when they built this building, they thought about everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that there is a lot to be said for empathy, and that's kind of what you're talking about. I oftentimes encounter people who tell me how horrible it is to be blind and what it's like to be blind. And I do say to them, the biggest problem is you've never tried it, because we don't internalize it. We make assumptions rather than understanding. And I agree with you. One doesn't need to be homeless to understand it. And one doesn't necessarily need to be hungry to understand it, but it does require us thinking about it.
Definitely. Like, yeah, if I guess like what you're saying, if it is something I have no idea about, I think also just a level of curiosity, right? Because I maybe think that's also what's missing. Like, if I don't understand it, why am I not curious about it? Why am I not trying to figure something out? Because it's not something new. Like what we say, like in every phase of your life, you're probably going to be encountering things. And so the small example I could give is, I remember once going to a dollar store, and I saw an old lady there, and she was sort of like struggling with with her cart. Her cart was really, really full, and the escalator and the elevator in the place was not working. And so I was like, this place, like this in this building, the escalator and the elevator weren't working for 2 years. And I said to one of my friends, I can't believe it's been almost 2 years and they haven't fixed this. And of course, this is a Dollarama in the middle of Toronto downtown. Like, if you are in a Dollarama, this person is probably even economically not in the best position. And you want to give them an extra struggle of just being able to access the space. And yeah, for me, it really just blew my mind. I really thought about that. And I was like, wow, 2 years. Like for 2 years, they've been okay with the fact that like, oh, people can't access this only Dollarama in like 3 square kilometers, by the way. So yeah, the mind still boggles. I think that's the thing. I wish we could have empathy injections.
We need something. It's important that we be more curious. And that's, again, something that we don't necessarily see a lot. I've talked a few times about people and the podcast where we choose not to be curious, or we're taught not to be curious. We talked about the disability issue a while ago, and oftentimes little kids would want to come over and talk to me or my wife, who was in a wheelchair her whole life. She just passed last November, but she, we would hear kids or see kids. I want to go ask this lady something, or I want to go pet that dog because I have a guide dog and all that. And the parents would say, oh no, you don't want to do that. You might offend them and this and that and the other stuff. And the bottom line is we discourage curiosity, and the kids are naturally curious. And most of us understand that and would love nothing better than to answer any questions. And sometimes I've actually, when I heard those discussions, I'll go over and I'll say, wait a minute, you want to pet the dog? I'll take the harness off and explain why I'm taking the harness off. Now you can pet the dog. Do you know what the dog does? Or I've seen my wife, Karen, go over and say, what do you want to know about the wheelchair? And the parents are being embarrassed, but they don't understand that it's a wonderful teaching moment.
Absolutely. And if anything, I think children actually understand empathy at such a higher rate than a lot of us. I think a lot of us get a bit more cynical when we get older. Because when I think of a lot of the conversations we've had about identity, I feel like because children don't expect people to show up in a certain way, they just accept everyone. And so what did they call it? Like it's not, I don't know if the word is openness, but I think because children are imaginative, for them it's, I don't see why they can't be different kinds of people and just have it that way. So yeah, I really had to think about that. And even this thing of like something as small as our friendship circles, exactly what you're saying. You're like, do we just stick with people who are exactly like us and we close our world even more?
All too often. Which is really part of the issue. And again, as I said, with children, we're teaching them not to be curious. We're teaching them not to be open. rather than encouraging that curiosity and that openness, which would be a much more wonderful thing and make the world a much better place. Because if they grew up curious, then they would continue to explore. Richard Feynman, who was one of the very famous physicists from the 50s and 60s and in the 40s, and one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, wrote a book entitled "Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, Adventures of a Curious Fellow." And even in the first chapter, he says his father pushed him always to be curious. And he grew up continuing to have a curious mind, which I think is extremely important for all of us to do.
Wow. I love that, because I think also it's lately I've been calling it curiosity over conviction. I think part of what knits us into little boxes is some of these things that are convictions that really should have just been curiosities, right? That, like, is this thing really as important? Will this really change the world or shatter the world? And if we put some of those things where they should be placed, right, as like, okay, this is just a preference, it's not like something really huge, I feel like, yeah, we'd explore more, we'd be more curious. And I think even when we look at the nature of how they do dialogues, it's always exactly that. It's saying, if you can hold space and say, my view is my own, but it's not the only view, and just accepting that small thing, it's like, it's amazing how all of a sudden problems became opportunities and possibilities. So I do think there's some power there. Yeah.
Well, and we all have our own views, but do you think it's also appropriate for us to have a mindset that says, okay, I've got my own view, I like my idea, but you know what? I'm willing to listen. And if somebody says something that really makes me change, that's okay?
Absolutely. To me, that's the curiosity, right? If I'm saying anything that isn't this answer is wrong, I'm also preventing, I guess, cross-learning to happen, right? And so I think that whole really thinking about, there is a reason how this, like, why this view got built in the first place. More often than not, yeah, a mixture of it might have been things we were told, right? So we may not have given it a lot of thought, and we talked to someone else and then we're like, that's interesting. And you think of something in a different way. But a large part of it as well is our what we call frame of reference, right? If my frame of reference is these 1, 2, 3 experiences are the most important and it shapes my opinion about this thing. If I talk to someone with a different one, I get to just like encounter a whole new world. It goes back to what I was saying about why I enjoy traveling, right? That just seeing something done differently, or seeing the same thing I worry about be perceived as something happy. I'll just give you an example. There's a colleague of mine, and she's always posting on LinkedIn about her ADHD is her superpower. And I always thought like, interesting. But now it's like, it gave me a different view of like, we actually overthink some of these things and be like, this is something that actually makes you different and makes you operate in the world in a different way. And that's a good thing. And that just changes the language of it. And so for me, I think there's that we can open our world so much if we, judge list and put things in boxes.
People often have asked me over the years, well, you're blind. Do you want to see or don't you want to see? And I understand eyesight well enough to recognize that it offers some things. But as I tell people, probably because it'd be a new adventure. But if I don't, it's not going to be the end of the world. Because in reality, eyesight just offers us another lane on the road to travel that we all do. And we've got to stop thinking that one way is less than another way. That's, I think, the biggest issue is we've made value judgments as to what is and is not, which is why I always have, and I've learned this, especially during this podcast, to not like the term visually impaired, because visually impaired, first of all, visually, I'm not different because I'm blind, but this is the way the professionals have treated it for so long. But the other part is impaired. And that is, I shouldn't be compared to someone based on how much vision I have. If you are a deaf person, your community doesn't like hearing impaired, and you're liable to be shot if you call a deaf person hearing impaired. It's deaf or hard of hearing. And likewise with blind people, it should be blind or low vision. Forget the concept of impaired. It puts a stigma on us. And again, I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that helps the bad mistakes that we face.
Absolutely. And I think also with what you were talking about earlier, honestly, it's also that I feel like you have a different kind of sight. There is more of an insight that comes in understanding something using a different sense, because you want to be able to say, what's it like to taste this thing? Or do, like I feel like we don't really value, how do I say, the exploring of the world in that way, because there's a whole world that you encounter that I still am yet to understand because I rely so much on this. So I think it's also thinking of that in a different way, exactly like what you're saying. It's not, I think it's that lack of curiosity again. That's the best way to describe it. It's a lack of curiosity.
Yeah. Well, and it is something that we hopefully over time will learn to counteract, and that we will help children and adults be more curious. And there's nothing or shouldn't be anything wrong with being curious.
Absolutely. So I think, if we do a book together, it's no longer going to be the Curious Case of Benjamin Button, but we're going to create more curious cases.
Nothing wrong with that. So, something I've talked with a couple of people on Unstoppable Mindset about is imposter syndrome. And I understand it a little bit. And I talked to one person who realized he had it and was able to deal with it. But how does imposter syndrome shrink or affect authenticity? Because I would think that since that the whole concept of imposter syndrome is becoming more of a topic of discussion, that it affects other things. And one of the things that seems to me that is worth discussing is how it affects authenticity.
Absolutely. I think imposter syndrome has to do with that fear of not showing up the way other people want you to show up. So it still gives that power to the external, all right? And yet, ironically, I think that there was always that statement that they say, when your internal validation is low, that is when you want the external validation. And so I think when we're in a space of imposter syndrome, we feel we don't measure up for other people, and that somehow impacts the way we view even ourselves. And yet, honestly, if we just were humble enough to even get over ourselves and just say, I'm in this space and I've been given room to speak or do this thing, it's more the happiness of being there should allow you to actually be even more, how do I say, like more vocal, or more like use the space that's actually been given to you. It's literally giving someone a platform and saying, here, your voice is going to mean something in this room. And then you decide to actually, quieten yourself and you say, I'd rather not speak because I don't feel like I should be here. And so I think goes back to what you're saying of a value judgment. We use some strange lens to decide that we're an imposter. We're literally pretending to be in this place we shouldn't be in. And yet I think exactly like what you said, most people have gone through stages in their life when they felt that. And I think they say a lot of women have it because, again, there's some of the societal things we're still working out, where you're made to feel like you should actually, be grateful that you're here. So you feel like you don't measure up. But yeah, it's hard to be authentic then, because you don't even have a good sense of who you are at that point, right? At that stage, you're not seeing what value you're bringing to the table or to the room. But if you were to hold on to those nuggets that you could bring to that place, see it as an opportunity. I have an opportunity to say something or do something or make an impact. If we see that as an opportunity and not oh my gosh, I'm just going to fail so badly. I'm going to fail so badly and just ruin everything. And yet it's like, no, like see the positive. Yeah.
do you think that most people deep down really know what they feel, but they're just afraid to deal with it. And so things like imposter syndrome or unauthentic or inauthentic things take over, but that they really know, and that adds to the stress.
Absolutely. It's like layers of, so they're the barriers other people can put in front of you, but then they're the worst ones that you then put in front of yourselves. And so I definitely think that if we could, like, when I had burnout, I remember that someone was like, we all have malware. We all have certain malware. But if we can actually do a virus scan and look and say, what are the lies that I am carrying in my life, and how are they holding me back? And actually having a conversation with them, not so much ignoring them, because I do think we like to go with the distracting, but having a conversation with them, you'll actually understand that, like, you'd never say this to someone else. So why would you say it to yourself? All right.
Good point.
Yeah. We're our harshest critics.
Well, I reverse that and say I really think that we need to get away from that negativity, and we should say we're our best teachers, and we really need to do that. But that's, of course, the problem is and I did it for many years. I'm my own worst critic, because I would listen to my presentations, the public speeches that I give, and learn from them. But I always said I do it because I'm my own worst critic. Well, what I really realized was I'm my own best teacher. And when I started doing that, it changed the whole dynamic of even listening to the recordings that I make.
Ooh, that's powerful. See, I love that, because that then is even the failing forward. So even if you did something and thought that wasn't great, the next you've already got some experience to learn from. Whereas there's someone who's not even getting the experience because they're so afraid to even fail. That's a worse place to be.
Well, and failure, again, I agree with some of the motivational people who say failure is really just an opportunity. And it is. It's an opportunity to learn and grow. And we should never beat ourselves up over failing, but rather ask ourselves, all right, what happened that didn't go just quite the way I wanted? How do we deal with it?
Absolutely. And I also love, I think Sarah Blakely, the lady who founded Spanx, said her dad, every time she got home, used to ask her, how did you fail today? And that was something they would celebrate, finding out about something they failed about. And I always loved that idea of, like, again, there's a language we use.
It is.
That makes judgment calls about, like, you did this thing, you got the F. I mean, everyone knows what that red F feels like, right? Yeah. And yet it's exactly that. It's like, oh, an opportunity to learn something or whatever. That'll be a different way of viewing the situation.
Yeah. And I think turning things into a more positive thing rather than beating yourself up, like using expressions such as I'm my own best teacher, change the whole dynamic in an incredible and swift way, which is, I think, extremely important for us to do.
Yeah.
Well, with you dealing with physicians and so on, and of course, in our world today, we've gone through a lot of different crises. What do you think that people need the most in a recession or depression, and why do you think it?
Well, I think it is, they do need hope, right? Hope is inanimate, but I think it's such a critical thing. But then I also think that it is, what do I say? Like, it's almost like a personal kindness. And I think we need to reinforce, how do I say it? Reinforce. Oh my gosh. I forgot where my thinking was on this one.
Depression and recession.
Yes, that's what it's like. I think there is so much depression in well, actually, we can call it might be a depression. They might call it a depression 10 years from now. We don't know. Yeah. But I think it's implied in the name, right? That it's everything around you is going to want to pull you down. And we need to understand the things that help us go in that opposite direction. And so for me, I think sometimes it's small things. Like sometimes I'll filter out news. Like I actually give myself a news fast. And sometimes I'll even do something, if it's behaviorally, complaints fast. I literally, Sometimes we'll say, I'm not going to complain about something for X number of days. Because I remember there was research that said your brain chemistry even changes when you like complain consistently.
Mm-hmm.
And so exactly what you said, the power, life and death in the power of the tongue, there's so much there about what we say to a situation. And so I think we always see the soft stuff, the frilly stuff as the things that, don't matter. But that's what keeps societies going. I mean, I'm sure when FDR was awakening people, in 1929, there's something there. There was a hope that he was bringing that gave him I don't know how many terms he ended up having, 3 or 4?
4. Well, he died during the 4th, but yeah, 4.
Yeah. I think so much of that's hope. Yeah.
And people understood it. I collect old radio shows as a hobby, and I contrast how the media is today and how programs are and the people, as opposed to the way they were in the 30s and 40s around the war and all that. And there was a lot more rallying and supportiveness than there is today. And we just look for ways to criticize and tear everything down. And we don't look and understand. And again, it all goes back also to curiosity and not wanting to be confused with the facts.
And I think also shared trying to experience the shared experiences together. If I remember that time when we had one of the longest lockdowns, right? I'd say probably one of the longest lockdowns in the world. But one of the things, that was the first time I saw positive messages on the news. So I wondered about that, this whole thing where we always say we want hard news and we riddle people with these like things that are just going to make them feel afraid, feel angry, feel like all kinds of negative emotions. And yet there was an intentionality to positivity then, because they were like, people are in their homes and we really need to care about their mental health and things like that. And I'm like, why should that be a lockdown thing? Why can't that be a way of being? And why can't we have that kind of balance? I mean, if you think about it back then, exactly like you said, the radio show is a thread that connected millions of people back then. Now we just have our own little echo chambers all over. We're just even more disconnected and isolated than ever before. In the UK, they have a ministry of loneliness. That is how bad it is, where you literally have a ministry dedicated to the problem of loneliness. So I think that is hope unites people in a way that fear and anger and hate and all these things, it's an opposition to that, right? So yeah, I think let's do that. Let's have a new currency of hope.
There you go. Well, here's a question. What conversation is the world not having, but we should be having?
There's so many. But I think
yes, there are.
There's so many. I think the one is honestly around nuance. We've touched on it a few times today, but this thing of zero sum, we have such zero sum language nowadays that just kind of cuts conversations off. We're killing our curiosity in that way. And so everything is talked about from an angle, from an agenda. It's like, if it's done this way, even the algorithm will push you more to, you just need to click on one thing and you're going to get a slew of other things that are reinforcing that idea. And yet I feel we need more just exploration, that curiosity, and say, oh, what makes this thing bad? What makes this thing good? Let me weigh for myself. But there isn't that anymore. It's literally you.
Yeah. And the conversation of why can't we be curious is definitely an issue.
So it's interesting if we think of exactly like what you're saying in schools, maybe the curiosity is still there because kids are younger, but what is happening to us later on in life that then stunts that curiosity altogether?
Well, the problem is that so many people are growing up learning not to be curious and being discouraged from being curious, and so they pass it on.
Ooh. You've opened a whole other can of worms.
That opens a can of worms.
Passing on a lack of curiosity. I'm like, oh, that's its own. Wow. Yeah. Because if you can give trauma and everything else based on experiences, you could give whole world views based on I'm not curious, so why should you be curious? I think that's the conversation that ends up happening.
But if you go back and look at why am I not curious, and you go back and study it, it's probably because you were discouraged. I'm sure there are some people who are born not curious, but generally I suspect that we're discouraged from being curious.
Absolutely. I'd say with one thing as well, since we've had a lot of new things thrown at us, I would say in the past 15 years, they're just things that did not exist 15 years ago, and we've just been riddled with them. I think there is an element of we just don't even get to process anything, right? So forget even curiosity. We haven't even begun to look at how something like the pandemic really impacted all of us long term, right? We don't even have the time to do that because one crisis after the next. And so I think there's also some of that. We're just surviving. That it's like curiosity seems like a luxury. So how do we get out of that? Like just surviving.
That's a very good point. We can do it, but we don't. And again, there's a lot of our politicians discourage it. So, that's another story, but we won't go there. Well, I want to thank you for being with us. This has been fun. Do you know we've been doing this for over an hour? So time. Yeah, see, and you didn't even say you were hungry, although I know it's late back there. But this has been a lot of fun. If people want to reach out to you, maybe learn more about the association or learn more about you, how might they do that?
Oh, well, definitely they can. I mean, they can email me. I am ed@bpao.org. Bravo Papa Alpha October. I don't know if I still have my phonetics right.
Well, you're close.
And also they can go to the website as well, www.bpao.org, or they can search me on LinkedIn. I think you did a good job of trying to say my name, but I'm sure they can, see it somewhere else as well.
Well, you say it.
Chenai Kadungure.
There you go.
Oh, thank you so much for
this has been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope all of you listening have enjoyed it. Love to hear your thoughts. Please email me and feel free to reach out to Chenai and engage her in a discussion as you will. But if you'd like to reach out to me, you're welcome to do so by email, michaelhi@accessibe.com. That's michaelhi@accessibe.com. Or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhinkson.com/podcast. So that's www.michaelhinkson.com/podcast. Love to hear from you. And please give us a 5-star rating wherever you hear this podcast, wherever you are. We really appreciate your ratings and your value and your comments and your input. And Chenai, for you and you listening, if you know anyone who we ought to have as a guest on Unstoppable Mindset, really, we want to hear from you. I want to know, and we're always looking for guests. So please don't hesitate to suggest other folks and help us meet them. So one more time, Chenai, I want to thank you for being here and taking this time with us today.
Well, thank you for being a light in dark spaces. I think just even the name, Unstoppable, that excites me because exactly what you said, so much of our everyday is how do we stop people? How do we stop certain things? So thank you.